Good afternoon. A very warm welcome to today's webinar hosted by Aperio Intelligence. My name is Vivian Lee, and I lead Aperio's Asia Pacific team. My team supports Aperio's 4 service lines, including due diligence, investigations, strategic intelligence, and ESG. Today's topic is decoupling from China, managing reputational and compliance risk in global supply chains. I have personally been following this topic for a long time. In the past year, my team has advised clients on supply chain related matters in Asia, particularly in China. I am delighted to have this opportunity to explore the topic further with our excellent panel of experts who will approach the topic from different angles. For today's webinar, the key questions we all have are: how can business with global supply chains navigate the challenges of increased geopolitical tensions between the US and China? How are they responding to changing regulations? And lastly, how can they protect their reputations among consumers and other stakeholders? We have an hour for this webinar. We will start with 3 presentations prepared by the panelists, then followed by a Q&A. If you have any questions during or after the presentations, please do send across using Zoom's Q&A function. With that, let me introduce each of our fantastic panelists here. Firstly, joining us from Seoul, South Korea, quite late in the evening, is Dr. Jun Park. Jun is a political economist and an East Asia Voice Initiative Fellow at the George Washington University. We are also delighted to welcome Jessica Bartlett, who is joining us from Hong Kong. Jessica is the Global Head of Financial Crime Legal at Barclays and Chairperson of the American Chamber of Commerce in Hong Kong. Finally, a very warm welcome to Carlos Busquets, who is joining us from Washington, D.C. Carlos is the Senior Director, Public Policy at the Responsible Business Alliance. Welcome to all our panelists. I am excited to have you here today sharing your expertise. So let's get started. Firstly, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Jun Park. One of Jun's research area is trade, tech, and energy conflicts between the US and East Asia. Jun will provide a high-level overview of the ongoing decoupling with a focus on technology sector. Jun, the floor is all yours.
So thank you very much to Aperio Intelligence for the invitation, and to everyone who is attending at the moment who are taking up an interest in this topic. My role today is to sort of present the background of the geopolitical / geoeconomic conflict, to set the background for my other panelists to assess the risk factors. And in order to do so, let me just bring up the 100-day review of the US supply chain that just came out from the White House. And mind you, after the inauguration of Biden, there were some speculations about whether the Huawei ban, whether there would be some lifting or whether there would be some easing on the sanctions. But as we see going into past maybe half a year into the Biden administration, we see that there are some changes, particularly on the energy front, but not specifically on semiconductors, or even the tariffs have not been lifted, although there may be some changes to how the tariffs would be revised. So my point to deliver to you tonight is, well, tonight and today for some people, is how it's going to look like on the semiconductor front. And coupled with that, perhaps lithium batteries, so EV vehicles, and what that means in geopolitical terms as the US sort of tries to divert from the supply chains, any kind of provision of advanced semiconductors to China. So let me bring some regional insights into the discussion. the 100-day review of the US supply chain, they incorporate not just semiconductors, but the large capacity batteries, critical minerals, the rare earths mostly, and then pharmaceuticals as well. But I think the key here are the first three, the semiconductors, then batteries, and the REEs, rare earths. And on the semiconductor front, I think this was something that was in the coming 2 years ago when the Japanese export curbs on South Korean critical, Japanese export curbs to South Korea on 3 very important semiconductor materials. There was a ban, and then 2 years in, those 3 elements, 2 of them have been successful in domestic production. But DuPont will be coming in to South Korea to produce photoresist, and along with that, CMT slurries as well. So what we see here is the quest for the US to dominate in the semiconductor supply chain. And be it Huawei ban or be it any kind of other measures to block advanced chip supply to China, it is very clear that the US wants to take the lead in this domain. And coupled with that, the market for electric vehicles, as well as the energy, renewables, mostly renewables. So in addition to that, what I'd like to pinpoint on is how the supply chain is becoming weaponized by the day. And for investors, I think it's important to note that, there may be further not easing, but further toughening of measures from the US side as it tries to gain its position in this, in several of these up and coming technologies, not just semiconductors, but incorporating AI, incorporating technology, connectivity, 5G, 6G. So beginning with chips, all of these are intertwined, and we're expecting to see more of these happen. Do I have more? Maybe a couple more minutes? Okay, so let me just end with a couple more insights from the regional dynamics. So let me share this slide with you. Are you able to see this? So the way it looks like is the Huawei ban is going on a different level. Basically, when the Trump administration just announced it and tried to fortify the decoupling process, it did so in some ways not so diplomatically. In the Biden administration's case, I think it's trying to make it more comprehensive, not to mention China directly, but to say that this is the kind of supply chain we will build with like-minded partners. But in it, China is not there. So when you see this equipment making, designing, and manufacturing foundries, fabs, what's important to note here is that the US is taking the momentum to have these partners produce within the United States. And it is in the interest of these like-minded partners to take part in the scheme if they do not want to be hit with tariffs. So it's a different version of the kind of weaponization that the Trump administration had implemented. South Korea has pledged $17 billion to build foundries in the United States, and TSMC as well, 6 factories, Arizona mostly. In addition to that, the coupling with Japan mostly, it will be around these 3 like-minded partners on the chips. And then you have potential, I did not completely cut out this part, the raw materials part, because it's a little bit uncertain how this would unfold, especially with the procurement of these minerals from Africa. So, but what we expect to see is more confrontation between the US and China on gaining these REEs from not just Africa, but also Chile. So I'll end it there, and I will wait for your questions.
Thank you, June, for your excellent insight. I think you provided really great analysis of the tech decoupling and what that means for the US and China and also other East Asian countries. Perhaps we could circle back to some of your points later in the Q&A section. Now let's move on to Jessica Bartlett. Jessica, as a lawyer by training, advises compliance and legal teams, business lines, and senior management at Barclays on financial crime-related matters. She also works with the American Chamber of Commerce in Hong Kong. Jessica, we would be grateful for your insights into supply chain risk management from a legal and compliance perspective and your observations with regard to supply chain diversification that is happening in the region. Jessica, the floor is all yours.
Great, thank you, Vivian. I think where I'll start, because I think it flows well from where June was leaving off, is some of the developments that we've seen in the Asia region, particularly among the members of the American Chamber of Commerce, but certainly not limited to them. When it comes to trends of diversification, where people are just looking to expand their supply chains beyond, say, the footprint that they've had previously, which when you're out in this region largely means China. Some of that commercially has been going on for quite a long time and reflects the economic realities of what's happening, has been happening in the China labor market in particular. But we certainly saw increased pressure to do that when the Trump administration brought in the tariffs, and that certainly had some big impacts on certain sectors. And it could be quite sector specific depending on how those tariffs affected their industries. That has in a way only been ramped up as the relationship between the US and China has evolved or deteriorated. And again, that is somewhat sector specific, as June has talked about, the particular impacts on tech, but we're not seeing it solely limited to tech. And part of that is also related to the pandemic. Right, that has brought home to many companies and countries the need to look more closely at their supply chains and where they're sourcing, maybe diversifying so they're not overly reliant on one jurisdiction, or localizing. So those are, conversations that are ongoing and lots of drivers that we see. How does that play out? It's really difficult to relocate a supply chain in many respects. Certainly very quickly, it can be quite difficult to relocate that, particularly as many industries over time, their products become quite complex, and how they do all of the sourcing for that is not a simple matter. They may require very sophisticated manufacturing, et cetera, talent and labor pool. But we are seeing those efforts at diversification playing out in the region, but they're playing out in interesting ways. So when we've talked to some of the members at the American Chamber of Commerce, some of what we hear is that there's actually, given the tensions between the US and China, that certain companies have chosen to diversify away from the United States or United States companies because they see risks of being overly reliant on US companies in certain sectors if they're going to be prohibited from doing certain types of business in the region. But we have also seen companies diversify away from China in response to some of the developments between the US and China. That said, I think the way that many of our members and companies look at this is that the US and China are two of the largest markets in the world. And ideally, they would like to have exposure to both of those markets. They don't want to make a choice between the two unless they absolutely have to. So they are trying to navigate that and navigate what has become what we call kind of choppy waters as things develop between the US and China. So that means you get into managing risk. And I think you might wonder, why on earth is someone who does financial crime talking about supply chains? And I think the reason why is how some of these, the laws have developed, and how the US in particular, but not limited to the US, has adopted certain tools to go after what you might think of as supply chain risks, right? And that has primarily meant the use of sanctions, the use of export controls, certain imports controls, but also overlapping with foreign investment restrictions. So for those of you who are familiar with CFIUS, either CFIUS or CFIUS style restrictions, like we're seeing, you might see in the Information Communications Technology Supply Chain Executive Order that was issued by President Trump about 2 years ago. And I think I can kind of offer a bit of an anecdote. When I was in private practice back in the United States, it was around the time that the UK was passing the Modern Slavery Act. I did sanctions, and a whole group of people started getting really engaged with how are we going to ensure compliance with the Modern Slavery Act? How are we going to advise clients on to, you know, conduct supply chain due diligence and look at their supply chains and root out, you know, modern slavery, identify it, et cetera. And those were considered very separate worlds, right? Like we knew each other, we presented to each other, but we did not engage on projects together. And if you come 5 years from now, what do you see? You see the United States and the EU and the UK imposing economic sanctions on certain actors that they allege are engaged in forced labor, right? These things are starting to come together and the risks are coming together. And I think you'll see that going forward. So the silos that we used to have in all of these areas are being broken down, and the different groups have to talk to each other, because you can't manage risk in a silo. Risk doesn't work that way. If a company has risk, then it needs to be managed with a bevy of tools, as opposed to just, why do this one little, you know, box here. Most of the regulators will tell you that you need to manage your risk using risk-based approaches, and not one size fits all, not check the box, because that's not effective. And the regulators and the authorities are increasingly focused on companies having effective risk management tools, not just do you have a policy or do you have some sort of control? Is it actually effective? And if you have one person doing sanctions who has no idea what, you know, modern slavery risks are, you could run into a scenario where your risk management tools aren't actually effective because one person's doing one thing completely unaware of what the risks are in another area. So the little bit of time I have left remaining, I thought I might just add a little bit of meat on the bone for, you know, where we see some of these risks coming up, particularly from a financial institution perspective, because in some ways we've been managing these risks for some time. And that's to look at what's been happening I'll focus on the US side because I'm a US lawyer, also because there's just the most amount of activity. But I do want to make very clear, the US is not the only game in town when it comes to these types of issues. So that's not to exclude or say that the others are not important. It's just to make sure that I speak where I can credibly speak, and it's a nice example. So we have seen, when it comes to how the US has been focusing its efforts on China, it has been using its financial sanctions tools. And those have really come in two varieties. One is to impose sanctions on certain actors and broadly prohibit dealing with them. And it has largely done that with respect to activities in Xinjiang. So we've seen sanctions imposed on certain officials in the region, but also on a very large corporate entity that also is known as a paramilitary entity, Xinjiang Production and Construction Corp, or XPCC. Now that's a very blunt tool that the US has used, and it just says broadly US persons are not allowed to deal with them. And from a non-US person or a financial institution that may not be itself United States incorporated, that can have impacts as well, because the way that these sanctions often work is not just you, US person, can't deal with them. They also will say, you know, you US person cannot facilitate a non-US person to deal with them, and a non-US person can themselves face sanctions if they materially support this person. Those are a couple examples. It gets quite technical, its application, but you have to understand that these sanctions, they are foreign policy tools, and they can have very broad impacts that go beyond just, you know, no US person shouldn't buy an XPCC product, for instance. And that's where we get into, identifying, that risk and looking at financial flows related to those companies. What has been, and I think we'll probably get into in some of the Q&A later, the more, and a very interesting development is the new sanctions that the US imposed on what it's calling Chinese military industrial complex companies. These are sanctions that only impact US persons' ability to trade securities issued by these companies, derivatives that reference those securities, or other financial instruments that provide investment exposure, including through funds. They are actually quite targeted when you're talking about sanctions. And effectively, they are kind of a supply chain tool because they go after the supply of investors for these Chinese companies. And for purposes of our discussion, what is interesting is that the name says military, but when President Biden amended these sanctions just a few weeks ago, he indicated that he would also target companies that were engaged in surveillance, and engaged in surveillance that they allege is related to repression and forced labor again, or other human rights violations. So they are looking to use that tool to go after what they consider the same kind of malign conduct that shows up in supply chain. So not only maybe can that company not supply you with cotton, but you may not be able to buy their securities either and supply them with capital. They can't raise capital from you as an investor. So that's a quite unique tool that they're using. And not to take up too much time, but I will end a little bit on just talking about another area where the US has been quite active and where we would expect to see a lot more activity, and not just from the US, but also from China. And that's in the use of export controls. And these are, this is a tool that a lot of people can understand. They basically say, if I develop technology, I'm not necessarily going to give that to everybody else. I may only want to give that to certain people. And that makes sense. If you develop a fancy new technology and you think someone's not your friend, why would you want to give that to them? Why would you want your company selling it to them? And those controls do follow the product, and they follow the product where it's through where it's manufactured. So even if it's manufactured in China or in Korea or in Japan, those controls and restrictions can apply. They can be quite broad in their restriction, and it's certainly something that has led to a lot of decoupling. As June mentioned, if you look at how Huawei has been treated by the US, those are the types of tools that were initially first used to limit Huawei's ability to get at US supply. And we see China responding in turn. It's developing its own export control regime, and it has its own maybe well-founded trepidations about having its technology supplied to certain countries, and the US may well be one of those countries as it wants to develop its technology sector and be protective of it. So we're seeing a lot. You have to understand all of those risks and how they impact your business. That's always the first step. And the second step is to think about that risk holistically, whether, as a legal matter, you can deal with them, whether, as your risk appetite, these are not often black and white issues. There are often many, many shades of gray, and it often can be quite difficult, which I think Carlos will get into. It can be quite difficult to conduct some of the due diligence that you need to truly understand who it is that you're facing and who they deal with and what products that they have, and whether they're compliant with just law or whether they're compliant with your expectations. Those can be quite difficult questions to work through, but they're the types of questions that you start to work through to identify and manage your supply chain risk.
Thank you, Jessica, for your insightful presentation. I agreed. Some of your points regarding supply chain due diligence, that's one of the quite important steps to look into as a first step to mitigate risk within your supply chain. So naturally, let's move over to Carlos Vasquez. Carlos works with business on CSR-related matters at the Responsible Business Alliance. Carlos, we will be grateful for your views on how companies are responding to increased pressure from regulators and consumers to ensure responsible supply chains. Carlos, the floor is all yours.
Great. Thank you, Vivian, and good evening, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks to Aperio for inviting me. I think my previous panelists have laid out the complexity very well. Obviously, in the electronics industry, the semiconductor industry, but also in other sectors, as well as the legal and regulatory challenges that are arising. I'm going to take a little bit of a broader view and not only talk about China. Certainly, China is a critical actor, and it's a critical actor for us, and happy to delve into that a little bit more deeper in the questions, but really present you an approach on how some companies, mostly our members and their suppliers, have been trying to deal for some time now with this growing batch of regulatory compliance and other related developments related to responsible business sourcing. I'm also, if you bear with me, going to present a bit of a small introduction to the RBA, because I think it's important to understand our approach, which is really that by working together on these issues across the supply chain, companies can be much better prepared for some of the challenges that are out there. So if you bear with me for a quick second, I'm going to share my screen. So apologies if there's a slight delay, but I hope everyone can see my screen. But just to let everyone know that here at the RBA, our focus is, as Vivian alluded to earlier, is on creating shared value. A core part of our mission is a global electronics industry that creates sustainable value for workers, the environment, and the business community. So really, we were built, and we've been started since 2004 with a mission to kind of deal and deal with all these issues that we've talked about, whether it's forced labor, whether it's climate change, whether it's circularity, to try to fit in that sweet spot where we can help companies continue to improve and live into some of these international standards and practices that are out there. Just a quick touch on RBA and its initiatives. As you can see, we have over 400 members of RBA and its initiatives. I particularly highlight two: the Responsible Minerals Initiative, which deals with strategic and critical minerals. We've been started in the space of conflict minerals, has now advanced to kind of develop an assurance programs that look at how cobalt and other minerals are sourced and get into the downstream of the supply chain. We are working in over 120 countries with over $7.7 trillion in members of annual revenue. Here's a bit of a snapshot. As you can see, some of the largest companies, particularly the electronics, we have the full supply chain going from the brands at the top to the OEMs and component manufacturers. We're also have begun to integrate the automotive industry, retailers, telecom, the toy industry. In a lot of our initiatives, we touch other sectors as well. Increasingly, as we find that electronics touches a part of all of our lives, more and more companies are coming to the table and trying to work collectively on these topics. So again, kind of piggyback on some of the topics that were mentioned today. When I look at it from a responsible business conduct angle, I see a really challenging environment. This is what we tell our board of directors all the time. We see increasing expectations on companies for responsible business conduct with greater and more sophisticated scrutiny of supply chain activities. It's no longer enough to just say, that's my supplier, or tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and I don't understand what happened. You are accountable, or increasingly accountable, for what your supplier may or may not have done. So again, there's a government interest to regulate supply chain behavior with more calls and measures for legal liability, not only reporting. And there's increasing investor and consumer demands for action and accountability. But all of this, and I think my fellow panelists said it very well, comes in a challenging environment. There are geopolitical concerns related to minerals, supply chain security, semiconductors, but other industries as well. There's overall increasing protection in sentiment and a lack of global cooperation, all of this made worse by COVID. And frankly, governments don't really understand supply chain operations. I mean, these are extremely complex. When you look at the supply chain of these electronics companies, it's a real complex web across many tiers, across many angles. It's not just components; it's also indirect spend, what we call indirect spend, which are services. It's a whole host of other things. They're operating in very challenging environments in different markets. So it is actually quite complex. And then there is a very strong and growing anti-business civil society voices that aims to discredit initiatives, industry efforts, and all initiatives on this, and is asking for very strong regulation, particularly in Europe, but also in the US. Here's my global regulatory snapshot. I actually haven't updated this to reflect the G7 statement on Sunday, but it's a snapshot. I'm not going to go into every laws, but you talked about the UK Modern Slavery Act. We will likely have mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence in Europe starting next year, or probably starting in a couple of years, but introduced next year. The Germans just passed this or agreed on a supply chain law, which they'll still have to pass in a couple of months. And you see a whole host of others. You actually, as we just mentioned, in China is developing its anti-sanctions regime. And again, you also see kind of right now, the US and other countries have the ability to restrict the imports of goods that they suspect made with forced labor into the United States. That is happening today. And it's being expanded. Canada now has it, and there's talk that Europe may develop it and other markets as well. So again, this is not going away. It's only likely going to increase. So at RBA, our view is to kind of bridge policy and practice. So we align with internationally recognized frameworks. Our tools are all linked into these, primarily the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights. It celebrates its 10-year anniversary today. That's, sort of how we structure everything that we do. Also the OECD's multinational M&E declaration, as well as its due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct and several ILO conventions. Part of our effort is by these companies coming together that share supply chains, share suppliers, they can collaborate, make things more efficient, more effective, save money on these measures, and also have shared leverage. In other words, if it's 5 of your customers asking you to change behavior in your supply chain, it's much easier to do that, and providing support to do that and have a positive impact. In terms of how we do this, we obviously start with the code of conduct. That's not enough. That's just a piece of it. But I just wanted to give you a flavor of the things we look at. Obviously, labor is our most important. Freely chosen employment is the critical aspect. Forced labor, and I can talk more about forced labor because we've been leaders on that space for some time and on the different aspects of it. But that is clearly a critical piece. But certainly basic things like occupational health and safety, environment, ethics, and really a management system approach. So it's about developing the programs or the system in your factory, in your facility, that can help you deal with these issues on an ongoing basis, not just on a one time. And we do this by a whole host of tools. Social compliance audits tend to get a bad reputation. The reality is they're one tool in the toolbox. Social compliance audits cannot save or cannot help all of these things, but they're one thing that can at least provide us a snapshot on where things are, and then can help you work to improve those conditions. So we have a whole range of programs. Our most important one is our validated audit program, our VAP, which is a program that is specifically tailored towards manufacturers across a number of industries. But as I mentioned earlier, we also have a responsible minerals assurance program, which looks at smelters and refiners to kind of assure the flow of materials into their supply chains, looking at tantalum, tin, tungsten, and gold, and now cobalt, and increasingly other minerals. For programs like forced labor, we have been piloting and scaling up, especially in looking at markets like Malaysia, but others as well, looking at the recruitment of workers, of labor. So we actually have programs that look at labor agents and sites, because a lot of times forced labor conditions are not at the factory, but are in the recruitment process. So how can we get towards ethical recruitment, and also maybe even end towards a certification, or maybe not a certification, but create a market for ethical recruitment. And finally, we're sort of scaling up now to look at things like chemical management and even scope 3 emissions in the supply chain. So again, kind of how to kind of harness this kind of power of collectivity to work together on all these issues. So with that, I'm going to stop. I know that's a lot. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions on a number of these issues, but happy to continue the conversation. And Vivian, back to you.
Thank you, Carlos, for your insightful presentation. And I agree that it is important to have a comprehensive program in place to ensure sustainable supply chains. And yes, you're right. Perhaps we could circle back to some of your points in the Q&A section. So let's continue our discussion by moving on to the Q&A sections. We've had a number of questions through, and please to keep them coming. If you would like to address the questions to address to any specific panelists, do know that as well. Let's see. The first questions, I think that's for Dr. Jun Park. The question is, how do you see the global race for semiconductors and other high-tech products playing out over the next few years? Which countries are well placed to take advantage from these competitions?
Oh, I thought I had the question from Ms. Anna Itkin, but I'll answer both of those questions in these following 2 slides. So first things first, the countries that are well poised to perform well are these 3 countries that you see in this slide. So South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan. Japan, not notably known for their foundries per se, but the technology that they've garnered over the past 3 decades or so before the DRAMS market was taken over by South Korea, they still have some technical leverage if they cooperate with the United States in the semiconductor sort of supply chain grouping. There is a high likelihood they can benefit, not become a leader, but benefit economically from the kind of cooperation that the US is looking for. South Korea, there is concerns abound about the leadership in the foundry area because TSMC is outperforming Samsung at the moment. And South Korea's excellence is not in system or logic chips, mainly in NAND flash, or so mainly in memory chips and DRAMs. So going forward, there has to be some uptick in South Korea's system chip development, not just in the fabrication of memory chips, but system chips in order to go forward. But in all cases, what we see is, as you see here, the data governance differences in the data governance of these two countries, and then the deployment of artificial intelligence in different ways, coupled with the network connectivity and the varying degrees of advancement in the chip quality, that would bring about the kind of decoupling that we envision. So if you see in this slide, this is a little bit related to what Ms. Itkin was asking, how this would actually impact sustainable development globally. So my hunch is scenario 1 here. If this kind of divide in the supply chain occurs, continues for more than a decade or 2, there is a high chance that there would be more divide between developed and developing countries in terms of digital competitiveness, and also in terms of the compatibility of not just digitalization, but infrastructure per se. So going forward, this means that sustainable development is not going to be guaranteed if this persists. And this is not it may not be good news, but for countries that are already having that leverage, it's good news. So there would be more lopsiding in the technology realm. That's my answer.
Thank you, June. So the next question is for Jessica. Do you think the implementation of circular economy strategies can help to secure supply chains? If yes, then to what extent?
Thanks, Vivian. And I will profess not to be any kind of expert in the circular economy. But one thing I think we can, which I think is interesting to touch on, and actually to some extent plays off very well with what June was just talking about, is the way that some of what we're seeing in supply chain restrictions and with the approach to ESG or sustainability, how those can work together, and how sometimes that can actually create a whole new set of risks. So when a company takes or an investor takes an ESG approach to their business, looking at ways to make their business more sustainable, more environmentally sustainable, to look and be more cognizant of how their company affects the communities that they're in, their recruitment practices when they're hiring, that can lead to analysis that shores up supply chains and reduces that type of risk that we've been talking about. Because you've got that lens that you're looking through all of your investments and your business dealings. There is, I think, in this current geopolitical environment, there are really two kind of risks that I would highlight, one of which June talked about. If we are seeing a decoupling, how globally sustainable is that when you've got a whole very large region of the world that you may have to strongly consider whether you can have any dealings with when you're in a decoupling scenario, particularly if that lasts long term, right? It may not, from a geopolitical global strategy, to have two separate worlds operating in parallel, at least in certain sectors, if not more so, query whether that actually leads to an overall, more sustainable outcome. But secondly, if you're trying to navigate between these two and you're adopting the ESG lens, what we have seen play out in China and in Hong Kong is that certain companies who made some bold statements about how they were going to reduce and remove forced labor from their supply chains, and that meant that they weren't going to source cotton anymore from Xinjiang, then found themselves in a very sticky situation in China, facing boycotts and reputational risk, because that forced labor is not recognized by China as a risk or something that should be addressed, and certainly should not be addressed through supply chain management or sanctions or export controls. And that's, the different rub of the decoupling scenario that companies have to mind. So in that sense, you can adopt that model, but there might be some other types of risks that you need to be mindful of if you choose to operate in certain markets.
Thank you, Jessica. Carlos, do you have any thoughts on this?
Sure. I mean, circularity is a critical piece for the RBA, and maybe to just touch on some of the points that were said earlier. I mean, certainly agree that this decoupling, these challenges make sustainable development, CSR, whatever you want to call it, much more difficult to achieve. I mean, clearly we need to work in all markets, and what we try to do is provide tools that enable responsible sourcing on all markets. I mean, we're based in DC, but we have an office in China, Brussels, Kuala Lumpur, and Mexico, so certainly all over the world. In terms of circularity, I mean, I think we see that as one of the most important pillars of our work. We focus on the circular, or on, kind of trying to create supply chains, the materials used in supply chains, a bit more efficient, a bit more effective. We've just launched a circular material landscape assessment that will allow companies to actually begin to understand what are some of the material flows that are coming, to provide accurate reporting and data for end of life for electronics, and assurance for EHS practices. So we see circularity, and we are engaged with a number of global partners, both NGOs and governments, and large scale international associations, on kind of trying to achieve a vision of circularity. I mean, for the electronics industry, circularity is critical. So certainly I would agree that it's one of the key pillars to achieve sustainable development.
Thank you, Carlos. Actually, there's a follow-up question here for you. To what extent is consumer pressure as opposite to new legislation forcing companies to mitigate forced labor and other risks in their supply chains?
So I'm actually, this question, it's a great question, and I would probably have given you a different answer a couple of years ago. So a couple of years ago, I would have told you, I've been 6 years in this position, and with the growth of this organization, I would have told you that, yeah, certainly consumer pressure, and you don't want your name in the newspaper, especially tied to forced labor. It's one of the most heinous human rights abuses in the world, however different forms that it can be. But right now, what we're seeing very clearly, I think what's bringing companies to our table across sectors are the regulatory drivers. Obviously, we alluded to the US, not just the sanctions, because I would say that's not an area that, or export controls, that we're that active in, or active in really that much, but certainly on the forced labor, tariff, modern slavery dialogue. So certainly that's bringing companies are trying to find a way to deal with this. You mentioned, I think Jessica mentioned the example of the apparel companies. No company wants to be in that position where it has to choose between one market and another. So if you can provide tools, and if they can do it collectively, it can help quite a bit. I think also take an eye on what's happening in Europe. If the European Union, as I think it will, in a couple of years, develops mandatory due diligence for environments and human rights across the board. I mean, they already have it on batteries, electronic batteries, through the battery regulation. But if this happens across the board, and this will probably have some sanction to be able to do business with Europe in one way or another, that's a game changer. And that means that it's no longer a choice to do responsible business or to opt for it, or that you're going to have to do it in order to deal with the EU. And probably something similar in the US, but maybe more focused on modern slavery and a bit more politicized, obviously, as has been said.
Thank you, Carlos. Jessica, you touched on the recent investment ban from Biden administration. So here is a question for you. Can you please tell us more about the investment ban and what that means for investors from the US and Europe?
Yeah, I touched on it a bit earlier. It's quite interesting. So what it basically does is it prohibits U.S. investors from either directly investing in certain Chinese companies that are on a list, or from having more what we call passive or indirect exposure through their investment in funds that have exposure. And it's the purpose, as stated by the U.S., is basically that they just don't want to see U.S. investors providing capital or capital markets funding to Chinese companies that it alleges are engaged in the military or supporting the military or engaged in technology surveillance, and in particular in relation to alleged repression or human rights abuses. So they're going after, taking a tool that says these companies do not, warrant or should not have U.S. investor dollars supporting them. So it's a different type of decoupling. We would call it like a capital markets decoupling. It only affects U.S. investors. So for investors who are European, they're not at this time subject to these restrictions. Query, whether through diplomacy, the U.S. is always talking about its allies, to what extent it's going to try to get the Europeans on board. That has sometimes happened, like has for Russia, but not in other areas. So we'll have to see how that plays out. But it's quite limited. So for example, for a company that's on that list, and I think just to make it really concrete, for most of the companies on that list, they're not consumer products companies, but it's still fine for a U.S. company to go buy one of those companies' products, for example, but they just can't assist in capital raising. So it is different in that sense. It's not as closely tied to what we think of as supply chains, but it is tied to, when you're in the financial services world, it is tied to a different type of supply chain, and that's investment supply.
Thank you, Jessica. Next question is for Dr. Jun. So which countries, particularly in East Asia, are set to benefit the most from the restructuring of the global supply chain? I think you touched that slightly, but perhaps you could explain that further.
Sure. The answer to this question is pending on a host of different geopolitical factors. But one is for certain that Japan is already getting on the tide with the United States to benefit tremendously from this move. So Japan is there. But what I'd like to flag about Taiwan and South Korea are geopolitical issues. So South Korea is not able to supply, is participating in the Huawei ban. So the semiconductor factories in for Samsung Electronics, the semiconductor factory in Xi'an and SK Hynix in Wuxi, these factories cannot supply to Huawei. There is a slight chance in the foreseeable future that the US will demand the closure of these factories if and when there is considerable demand for a request from the South Korean side to resume business with China. And on the Taiwan issue, I think, there are speculations that there would be a skirmish, not just a skirmish, but an attack within 6 years. This is the estimate from the DoD. If that's the case, then the facilities for semiconductor fabrication in Taiwan, they become under, they will fall under jeopardy. So I think Taiwan is taking on an approach that sort of lessens the kind of risk in the case of a geopolitical clash to fabricate facilities in the US as well as in Taiwan, and noting that there is no complete guarantee that it would be safe from any kind of attack. I think there would be a little bit of uncertainty going forward. When it comes to Europe, I think, though, if the Europeans try to solicit any of these foreign semiconductor firms to create foundries in Europe. There could be a synergy effect within the European landscape in terms of chip fabrication and auto companies as well. But that has not been decided, and TSMC has already ruled out that they will not build an additional factory in Europe. Samsung is a different question. So we'll have to see how that unfolds. And I think in general, Japan is probably going to benefit most.
Thank you, June. Perhaps Jessica, you could add a few points on this. Since you're based in Hong Kong, you might see something happening in the region as well.
I mean, I think it's something that I kind of talked about in my opening remarks, and I'm not necessarily going to add. I mean, June is a real expert in this area who's, you know, looking at this very closely. But we are seeing, you know, companies look at their supply chain, and we certainly are seeing in the tech sector that decoupling become very real. So when I sat on a panel talking about these issues 3-something years ago, everybody was talking about the automotive sector because of the tariffs, and now everybody's talking about technology and everybody's talking about semiconductors. And that first teed up as an issue with the restrictions that were being imposed on ZTE and Huawei, and it's just only expanded from there. And it does have a geopolitical gloss is not even the right word. It's at some point at a crux, a geopolitical issue, given where, you know, which companies and where they're located and the issues around Taiwan. So this is something that companies in the region are following very closely, whether they're in the semiconductor sector, and to some extent if they're not, because there could be spillover effects that they've got to plan a contingency plan for.
Thank you, Jessica. I suppose we have time for one last question, and this one is for Carlos. The COVID-19 pandemic has led to a loss of employment in many of the developing countries that in turn leads to an increased risk in child labor. Can you please share how are you helping companies to address this newly emerged risk?
Sure, and as I mentioned, certainly COVID has created an impact not only on child labor, but a whole host of other issues. For our core members in terms of electronics, and when we look at the issues, we don't deal a lot with the child labor issue, principally because we're looking at factories in a lot of the markets. So we do have issues with student or young workers sometimes, but that not so much child labor. However, as I mentioned in my presentation, RBA also houses a number of initiatives. One in particular, and actually a new emerging one that's sort of sitting next to it, the Responsible Minerals Initiative, is looking at you know, assurance on minerals that are coming into the supply chain in markets like the Democratic Republic of Congo. And there you've had, not just due to COVID, but you've had, you know, significant threat of child labor, risks of child labor, you know, and very horrible human rights conditions that have led to kind of folks having to put children to work, particularly in artisanal and small scale mines. So working with partners like the Global Battery Alliance, which is a multi-stakeholder initiative that came out of the WEF and is now sitting in with the RBA, you know, we have one that are finalizing an artisanal and small scale mining standard so that we can help provide the tools so that minerals that very importantly do come from this part of the world that make it into their supply chain are sourced responsibly. We're also working with folks like UNICEF and others on the ground to develop projects, and companies are helping in this regards, many of our large members, in trying to kind of develop livelihoods and education opportunities for miners, so that artisanal miners in particular, so that if they do have to enter into this field, they do it sustainably, they do it responsibly, and their children can go to school. I mean, it's still very difficult, you know, and COVID has made everything more difficult, but we certainly have a number of programs that are very, very important to us in this regard.
Thank you, Carlos. If any of you are interested in the programs Carlos mentioned, please do get in touch with him. Great. Thank you very much, June, Jessica, and Carlos, for joining us today. It has been a fascinating discussion. Unfortunately, we are reaching the end of this webinar, but if you have any follow-up questions, please do get in touch. On behalf of Apereo, I would like to thank you very much for joining us today. We are taking a break from our series of events over the summer, and we will be resuming in September. We look forward to seeing you then. Once again, thank you and goodbye.